Ancient Egyptians had no fridges, but they still had beer, cheese, fish, and beef. That didn't spoil. But how on earth did they manage to preserve such food without refrigeration? And why are we only just now finding out how genius it really was? Let's start with the method that kept the pharaoh's armies fed and tombs stocked. You see, Egypt's heat is unbearable. Fresh meat and fish spoiled in a few hours, tops. So once an animal was downed, the Egyptians either ate it fast or got to work preserving it. And for preserving, salt was their go-to tool. Tomb art and bone finds show people gutting fish and poultry right by the river. After gutting, they then buried them in salt or brine, and then let the moisture drain out. You've seen the tomb carvings of Nile fish being skewered and spread out to bake or cure. It looked like a whole salted fish business. One Egyptologist even points out that tomb fish scenes include salting and drying. Archaeologists have found big ceramic vats by the Nile. They were likely fish salting barrels. After all, fish in ancient Egypt was essential. Nile mullet, bony lates. But these spoil quickly if untreated. Some fish and small birds like quail or duck got skewered and smoked for a few hours. But most went sun-dried or brined. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, said Egyptians ate fish either raw and sun-dried or preserved with brine, exactly what the art shows. Even elite tombs include trays of salted fish offered to the dead. And in places like Athribis, they dug up town barrels doing the same job. Over in Amarna, they found jars stamped with the hieroglyphs IWF/D.R, which translates to preserved meat. You could say pickled meat, but it could also be dried. Now, in real life, a butcher might take a beef haunch or shank, rub it with salt and sometimes natron or ash, and then he would pack it into a clay jar. That salty crust kept flies out and helped the inside dry. When Howard Carter cracked open Tutankhamun's tomb, they found those famous meat mummy boxes, which were basically wooden crates holding wrapped joints of beef and poultry. Salted, resin-coated, and ready to last. The goal was to avoid spoilage, and the end result would have been a pantry that could survive Egyptian sun without turning into a biohazard. But now, what if you ran out of salt? You see, when salt ran low, or when time was short, the Egyptians went old school. Sunday and air. They'd lay fish or strips of meat on mats, or hang them in breezy huts, letting desert heat dry them down. Tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom often depict gourmands salting and sun-drying mullet, carp, and catfish. Not exactly haute cuisine, but it worked. Dried fish, and sometimes meat, could sit in storage for months. And it wasn't just protein. Dates, figs, grapes. Sun-dried, too. Need a sweet boost? Raisins or dried dates made cakes honeyed and moist, with honey being nature's shrink wrap. Museum inventories list dried fruits and honey cakes among offerings. Now, as for smoking, it gets a mention in later texts, but actual proof is scarce. Studies suggest it was more theoretical than routine. Sure, Egyptians roasted meat over coals or dried fish near the hearth. Incidental smoke flavor happened. But the idea of deliberately smoking meat as a preservation method? Well, again, Egyptologists assume it was possible in theory, but unlikely in everyday use. However, Instead of being dried or smoked, some foods were fermented into something new. For instance, beer made from barley or emmer was everywhere. And in this case, we're talking about beer that was mild, a little sour, and yet a lot reliable. This wasn't the craft brew that you're accustomed to today. You see, big ceramic containers in temple breweries and sealed jars show they soaked barley bread in water, let wild yeast do its thing, and then strained the brew into jars. A household batch could last weeks if kept sealed and out of the heat. And just so you know, it didn't stop at beer. The ancient Egyptians pickled vegetables in vinegar or salt, too. Papyrus recipes outline preserving onions and veggies in clay pots. Even tomb paintings show priests carrying jars of pickled condiments. In one late New Kingdom satire from the Papyrus Anastasi I, an official complains, "In my day, the beer spoiled. Now it ferments." In other words, they got better at it. But not everything needed time. Some things just needed a seal. After all, the ancient Egyptians had other tricks to preserve food back in the day. Think oil, fat, or if they felt fancy, honey, or syrup. In tomb workshops and offering scenes, you sometimes see meat slathered in oil or fat. Bronze tools from the New Kingdom suggest they rendered animal fat. Even texts list lard or butter as burial items. So clearly, fat mattered. They even labeled fat jars with MR, which translates to fat in temple inventories from the 18th to the 19th dynasties. That tells us it was a preservative. In real-life terms, they might dip cooked meat in fat to seal out air. Sort of like a medieval confit. Air gets out, spoilage stays out. And let's not forget about honey. That's right. Honey was used in offerings too. Luxury stuff, but it works as a preservative nonetheless. In Yuya and Thuya's tomb, which is around 1400 BC, beef legs were coated in a resin and honey mash. It was a sweet, sticky seal. Modern scholar Ikram even lists beer or honey curing as a known method in ancient Egypt. But here's the catch. You see, there aren't giant honey jars at butcher sites. Honey was more for sweet treats than daily meat preservation. Still, even without a warehouse of honey pots, they got the idea. Seal it with syrup or wax, and bacteria can't get in. But none of it mattered if you didn't store it right. Preserving food was half the job. The other half was keeping it safe. Even the best cured meat would spoil without the right container. This is where pottery, pits, and jars come in. The ancient Egyptians used vessels of every shape and size. Tomb paintings and texts show row after row of sealed amphorae and jars. Places like Edfu and Karnak had massive storage halls full of wooden bins and pottery for grain and salted meat. Domestically, they dug mud brick-lined pits or silos underground to keep bread and dates cool. And it's likely they did the same for fat-cured meat or beers, shielding them from the brutal sun. Down in mastaba tombs or underground, the earth's coolness did a little heavy lifting. One Egyptologist points out that emmer wheat, barley, beer, and wine were commonly provided in jars because they stored well. Well, yeah, and so did pickles, dried fruit, and salted fish. Basically anything they could seal in. Now, every bit of animal protein was a treasure. Cattle and goats weren't slaughtered every day, but when they were, the meat went straight to the spit. and anything left got preserved fast. Think jerky. A big game haunch, rubbed with salt and then left to dry. Even birds got the same treatment. One tomb held an ibis mummy, which was a cooked bird that was completely desiccated and saved. In the 19th dynasty, an official named Patams went all in. His tomb had vessels of fat and whole victual mummies, which were wraps of beef and antelope sealed like mini-human mummies. And get this, archaeologists found a 3,200-year-old jar of dried dairy curd. They analyzed the proteins, and it turned out to be cheese. Cow and sheep or goat cheese. And yes, ancient Egyptians made hard cheese. Probably delicious, but possibly full of brucella. Milk, meanwhile, had its own challenge: heat. As you probably know, cows, goats, and sheep, they made milk, butter, and yogurt, yes. But it turned sour fast. So, the Egyptians fermented it into labneh and cheese. That hard jar cheese proves they knew how to make shelf-stable curds. And since bread was a daily thing, it was baked in mud ovens, with leftovers dried into hard biscuits or crumbled into kamut. Then it was kept for weeks, if dry. Sometimes they'd ferment the dough with date syrup, then partially bake it into a beer bread called castatum, kind of like a long-lasting filling cake. Now, everything we've been talking about so far took a lot of work to achieve. But behind every jar was someone grinding, cutting, salting, and sealing. Lower status workers, often women, handled the dirty, repetitive side. Tomb paintings and ostraca show cleaners, kneaders, brewers, and storehouse scribes in action. At Deir el-Medina, you see women grinding grain and stirring vats. And as mentioned earlier, by the Nile, fish gutters, who were usually servants or day laborers, sat with knives and boards, cleaning fish. They used copper or flint knives, while wood and pottery trays held salt or storage. Now, it's one thing to guess. It's another to prove it with a microscope. You see, science backs it all up. Bone remains show cut marks and pore holes from drying. And fish scales still carry salt residue, barley starch and beer traces turned up in massive containers at a Hierakonpolis tomb. They even found cheese casein peptides from cow, sheep, and goat, clear proof of dairy preservation. Some oil lamp residues even suggest they doubled as food smokers. Put it all together, and you get dessert-savvy cuisine: salt, sun, fermentation, and a whole lot of labor. From dried meat on tomb inventories to millennia-old cheese in the lab, this was their refrigerator. And if they could preserve food without cold, what's our excuse for wasting it now?